Welcome to the Jewish Policy Center webinar. I am Shoshana Bryan, Senior Director of the JPC and your host. Before going to our speaker, I would normally give you the JPC commercial, but today is not a normal day. Today is the day after, if you will. Because of that, I'm going to start with a short statement from our parent organization, the Republican Jewish Coalition, and add our name to their name and their statement. The RJC and the Jewish Policy Center congratulate Joe Biden on his election as President of the United States. After the abhorrent mob attack yesterday on our Capitol, our elected officials went back to work, fulfilling their duty under the Constitution and certifying the results of the 2020 election. Now is the time for the same peaceful transition of power that the U.S. has carried out for over 220 years. It is also a time for healing, a time for unity in our country, because we face many and significant challenges. Can I have an amen? And now the commercial. The JPC was established in 1985 to provide perspectives and analysis of foreign and domestic policies by scholars, academics, and commentators. You can find us on our website at jewishpolicycenter.org. At our website, jewishpolicycenter.org, you can read our insight articles, our magazine In Focus Quarterly, and our In Context blog. We also have our Alliance Tracker and Frontline Defense blogs. The JPC supports a strong American defense capability, U.S.-Israel security cooperation, and missile defense. We support the legitimacy and security of Israel against anyone who would deny them. As an organization that sits slightly to the right of center, the JPC advocates for small government, low taxes, free trade, fiscal responsibility, and energy security, as well as free speech and intellectual diversity. That last one is a big one. Today, our speaker is David Weinberg, coming to us from Israel, and our subject is a happy one: the burgeoning relations between Israel and the Gulf states. David is the founding vice president and senior research fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, and Israel office director of Canada's Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs. He was the founding coordinator for the Global Forum Against Anti-Semitism in the Israeli Prime Minister's office, and senior advisor to then Deputy Prime Minister Natan Sharansky. He's also a diplomatic and political columnist for the Jerusalem Post and Israel Hayom newspapers. And you've seen him on our website periodically, and we love having him there. David was in the United Arab Emirates over Hanukkah to teach Torah and strategic affairs on behalf of koshertravelers.com for visiting Jews from around the world. That really already tells you where we're going. Remember, before we begin, you are muted, but you can send your questions through the Q&A function, and we will add them to our list of existing questions. So now, to take us away from Washington and over to the Middle East, and happily over to the United Arab Emirates, David Weinberg, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Shoshana, and thank you to the JPC for this opportunity, and good evening from Jerusalem. Jerusalem is somewhat quieter than Washington is, at least tonight. I'll start with a brief story, and then what I'd like to get into is my experiences and impressions of the Emiratis and Bahrainis that I met over a week in the Gulf recently. The story is almost a simple story. First night we were there, my wife and I went up to the 44th floor of the Hilton Hotel we were staying at, where they supposedly had a bar. We're not big bar goers, but we wanted to see what does a bar look like in the United Arab Emirates. And of course, the place alcohol was flowing, and there were Arabs and foreigners of all types mixing together. And two young Arab gentlemen, obviously identifying us as Israelis or Jews, came right up to us and started giving me a lecture, or it was actually more like a religious sermon about how we are sons of Abraham through Isaac, and they are sons of Abraham through Ishmael, and that makes us cousins and family and how wonderful it is to see us. It was almost like the guy was planted in the place to come over to us and make sure that we felt welcome. And the truth is, we had experiences like that the entire time we were there. The most common refrain we heard from Emiratis was, we're so happy that the peace with Israel has now gone public, and that we can now embrace you. Israelis and Israeli businessmen have been going to these Gulf states for approximately 15 years now, and it's now public and known that Israel's had interest sections there as well. But that was all under the table, and all was preparatory for this Abraham Accords breakthrough. Question the questions I ask is, how do they view us, and how did that lead to this Abrahamic narrative, to this breakthrough, and how do they see themselves and their role and the role of Islam in the modern world? And then we can ask the question together whether the type of thinking, the moderate and tolerant thinking that I experienced in the Gulf, might that be exported to other parts of the Arab world, especially to the Palestinians? Just before I go forward in that regard, I have to tell you how much dissonance we experienced in making the flight, the short 3-hour flight from Israel over Saudi Arabia into the UAE. We were enthused and excited about the Abraham Accords from stage one. We were even more excited to be making the trip. And it was impossible for me to deny, as a strategic analyst, that the new Middle East dynamic created by the Abraham Accords strengthens Israel and Western strategic interests, while weakening Iran, Turkey, China, and the radicals among Palestinians. And yet, in so much of the democratic world, certainly on the political left in the democratic world, people were not rejoicing. In fact, they were begrudging. And I think parts of the democratic left are still begrudging in their embrace of these blessed developments. And there's a number of obvious reasons for that, and we should probably lay them out in front of ourselves as we begin. Number one, for the extreme left, it's very hard to accept the fact that Israel is demonstrably a force for good, knowledge, prosperity, and stability in the Middle East. Second, parts of the left are very reluctant to give credit to Donald Trump or Benjamin Netanyahu for anything, even when the result is obviously so beneficial. Third, and that includes the incoming Biden administration, is eager to return to the JCPOA, the nuclear deal negotiated by Obama with Iran. And that's a deal that Israel and the Gulf states remain adamantly opposed to. The common front against Iran is, of course, part of the glue that brings Israel and these countries together. Fourth, and this in many ways is to me most interesting, I find that some of my friends on the Democratic left are very uncomfortable with the renewed religious discourse, that the discourse about biblical patrimony and rights, about Abrahamic cousins. To some ears, this smacks of either evangelical Christian or right-wing Orthodox Jewish standpoints. And then, of course, on part of the left, the fact that the Accords sidelines the Palestinians and makes it clear that their struggle is no longer the crux of the Middle East conflict, that is problematic. And they have many different ways of giving cold shoulder to the Abraham Accords, beginning with talking up human rights abuses in the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt once again. We'll come back to all that, but let me now focus, as I said, on the narrative, the discourse about Israel and about the Emiratis themselves that I discovered while traveling there. And I have to tell you that I'm persuaded that the Emirati pursuit of peace with Israel is genuine, because it's backed by a discourse of religious moderation and open-mindedness or broad-mindedness that is deep and admirable. Now, let me state up front that I've never been an acolyte of the Shimon Peres School of the New Middle East, nor a card-carrying member of Peace Now, and therefore I don't consider myself naive or gullible, but I learned that the Emiratis are different. They are a distinctive type of Arab Muslim. They want to redefine the self-identity and self-image and the global image of an Arab Muslim in a way that blends enlightenment with tradition. And that's how they see Israel. They see Israel as a country that blends enlightenment with tradition. So affiliating with Israel fits perfectly into their agenda. Now, they, of course, don't have a border conflict with Israel, but they have enough self-confidence and enough money to both partner with Israel in all the technological, educational, agriculture, and other and scientific and medical areas that they're interested in, and to assist the Palestinians to move into the modern world if the Palestinians are willing to do so. From the Emirati point of view, the core problem in the Middle East is religious hatred. Religious hatred has become a central political currency in the Middle East, and it's exploited by Iran, for example, which invests heavily in religious hatred with Israel, as well as hatred of the West, of America, and of other Muslims who don't hew to their radical line. And the IRGC, and the other Shiite militias use religious hatred to mobilize young men to their ranks. The Abraham Accords there, say the Emiratis, are meant to take religious hatred out of the equation and to turn Arab-Israel ties into back to the state of normal state-to-state relations. And the key to that, of course, is education. The Emiratis have taught a school curriculum which teaches religious and ethnic tolerance and the value of scientific and humanistic critical thinking for at least 15 years. And when they look at Israel, as I said, they see a number of things. They see, of course, that Israel is strong, militarily strong and economically strong. They see, of course, that Israel is resilient. It has overcome the great Arab armies of yesteryear, Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. And it's the only country in the region that is actively fighting the Iranian forces on the ground in Lebanon and Syria, and reportedly in Iraq and Iran as well. And therefore, they view us as Maccabees. I was there over Hanukkah. They knew to reference the Maccabees. But there's more. There's much more. The Emiratis respect Israel for its faithfulness to Jewish tradition, for what they see as our belief in the power of Jewish history, for our loyalty to ancient Jewish heritage and our unique national identity. That's what they want for themselves too. And believe it or not, the Emiratis seem to understand perhaps better than we do ourselves sometimes that these anchors of identity are the greatest source of strength and authenticity. I wrote a column when I came back, and I said that that reminds me of something that Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the late great Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sacks taught, and that is, he was absolutely convinced that non-Jews respect Jews who are self-respecting. Meaning the Jews who are knowledgeable about Judaism, proud to carry its banners. This applies to Zionist belief as well. Non-Jews respect Jews who are unapologetically self-respecting in their Zionism and see in their Zionism an opportunity to contribute to the world. That's how the Emiratis want to see themselves as well. And therefore, it was thrilling to discover this new narrative during the time that I was there. And some of the Emiratis are even willing to say openly. I met with a senior Emirati thinker who was very close to the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Zayed. He told me that Israelis should be allowed to pray on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and that prayer rights should be extended to Christians there as well. He said, you know, there's a reason why we can't expand the Temple Mount to make room for everyone who's there. Islam, he said, is not meant to deny others their deep connections to God. Of course, the question that everybody here in Israel has asked me when I returned and began to relay these experiences and my optimistic assessment of the strength of the peace that will yet develop between us. The question was, you know, how are Gulf Arabs going to influence the Palestinians, or for that matter, the Egyptians and the Jordanians, who've had peace treaties with Israel for 30 and 50 years, and yet the peace remains extraordinarily cold, even deep freeze cold. And in my view, there are several ways in which the Emiratis and the Bahrainis and the Moroccans and eventually the Saudis can begin to change Palestinian, Lebanese, Syrian, Egyptian, and Jordanian attitudes. The first is simply to succeed in the peace. The greater the concrete peace benefit that Gulf states are seen to have from their relations with Israel, the more attractive peace between Israel and the other Arab actors will become. Second of all, the Emiratis are already planning on offering their school curriculums on religious and ethnic tolerance and some sort of distance learning program across the Middle East. This is an educational export product that over time could have real moderating impact. And third of all, I believe that the Emiratis, Bahrainis, and others can have a real moderating impact, or at least try to have a moderating impact on the Palestinians by dialing down their expectations in advance of renewed peace negotiations with Israel, negotiations which I'm quite certain the Biden administration is going to pressure both sides to enter. They can do that in a number of ways. First of all, by changing some of their votes at the UN in Israel's favor. I am a little bit worried about that because the UAE is seeking a seat on the Security Council in about a year's time. That's generally not a time when you find nations moving closer to Israel. They usually pander to the anti-Israel side of the map when seeking a UN Security Council seat. I hope the Emiratis will be different. But the way in which they talk about the end game of a peace process is very important. They talk about a sustainable peace. I didn't find any Emirati speaking about a two-state solution, and certainly not one involving a division of Jerusalem or total Israeli withdrawals, and so on. I heard them talking about the fact that the Palestinians need peace with Israel more than Israel needs peace with the Palestinians. And they should remember this in Ramallah and Gaza, I was told by a number of Emiratis. And furthermore, talking about affirming Jewish prayer rights on the Temple Mount and ending the discourse about it being an exclusive Muslim site is an important part of turning back the political codes, the pro-Palestinian political codes that have held sway for so long. And therefore, there are a number of ways in which Gulf Arab leaders can usefully seek to move Palestinians and Israel, other immediate Arab neighbors towards moderation and maturity. In short, I came away greatly encouraged by my visit to the Emirates. I intend to be back several times in the coming months. As you've all read in the newspapers, Israeli businessmen, banks, universities, scientific institutes, think tanks, cultural institutions, women's organizations, and on, already partnering with the Emiratis and Bahrainis, creating a real warm peace being built from the ground up that we've never had with any Arab country before. And it's indeed very, very promising. I'll conclude with a statement of concern and caution by noting that the Trump administration was critical in facilitating and brokering these accords. The strategic interests, the common interests of the countries on a bilateral basis were there, and yet still it took the active involvement of the administration, the Trump administration, to bring these about. As we all know, the Trump administration offered add-on goodies in each case, whether it be fighter jets to the Emirates or recognition of the Sahara in the Moroccan case, similarly with Sudan and similarly with similar elements with Bahrain. And if the Biden administration does not approach the continuation of the Abraham Accords with the same enthusiasm, it won't change the intensity of the relations that have already begun to develop between Israel and the four countries that we're discussing, but it could slow down the process of expansion of these peace treaties to other parts in the Middle East. If the Biden administration barrels forward in reaching a deal with the Iranians that is not really much better than the Obama deal of 2014, regional parties will not look at that favorably, and it will introduce a chill into what is at the moment a three-way partnership between the US, these Arab countries, and Israel, and that would be unfortunate. I think I'll stop there. I'd be glad to entertain any questions that members of the listening audience have through Shoshana. Thank you again for inviting me. Glad to be with you.
Thank you. That gives us a good picture of what's going on, a very enthusiastic picture in some ways of what's going on. We have a number of questions. Some of them I'm going to lump together, but the first one is it possible for Israel to push too hard in its person-to-person relations in Bahrain and the UAE? Too much enthusiasm, too many Israelis, too much wanting to be close together. Can you scare them? I'm seriously, because these countries all have relations with other countries that are not favorably disposed toward Israel. So is it possible that Israel could be too enthusiastic?
Great question. There were many memes and jokes going around Israel before Hanukkah about Israelis swarming and swamping Dubai and stealing all the towels in the hotels, and that the Emiratis had better bolt everything down to the floor so Israelis don't run off with everything. Fortunately, that was not the case. There were minor incidents where some Israelis got drunk and dressed inappropriately, and a couple Israelis were thrown in jail, but there were 66,000 Israelis who traveled to Dubai in December, and by and large, it went smoothly. I'll tell you a couple of things about the Emirates itself that we have to recognize. It is a police state. It is not a democracy. And the rules are very clear. And they were laid out to Israelis before traveling there, that you have to respect local custom, you have to dress appropriately, you can drink in the hotel bars, and you can wear bikinis at the hotel pools, but you don't venture beyond the hotels in such situations. So far, it seems to have worked well. I mean, the Emirates are also an exceedingly safe place to travel. It's safe because the country is covered by a network of security cameras that is unparalleled anywhere in the world. There's almost no theft, almost no crime, no murder, no rape, because you can't get away with anything. So it's just better to behave. As an Israeli, as a Jew, as an Orthodox Jew, I was there with my wife, who looks like an Orthodox Jew as well, in terms of the way she covers her hair. We felt safer walking the streets of Dubai than I'm certain I would have felt any time over the past year in the streets of Berlin, Paris, London, and maybe even New York. Everybody was welcoming. There were so many other Israelis and Orthodox Jews there that it simply wasn't unusual. We even had I have a videotape of a little clip where we were waiting at 5 o'clock in the morning in the desert outside Dubai to go up in a hot air balloon over the desert outside Dubai and see the sunrise over the mountains just beyond Dubai. And my wife and I were partnered in one of the cells of the big hot air balloon basket with a young Emirati couple. It turned out they had just gotten married, and the young bride was covered head to toe in the black shayla and the black abaya. And she and my wife had a whole discussion about how they tie their kerchief and how they cover their hair. And I've got this video with both of them with their hands comparing notes. And it was so natural. And it truly was beautiful. Obviously, Israelis need to know how to handle the new relationship. What the Emiratis are most interested in is, of course, the business and tech ties. And that seems to be going very well. Tourism is a nice added touch, but that's not going to make or break the Emirati economy.
So a listener points out that a large number of people in the UAE are in fact guest workers, and that they come as they do to Qatar to build and to do those sorts of things. Does that help to make the Emiratis more cosmopolitan because they've already been interacting with and agreed on a different level, because the guest workers who come are not treated as Emirati citizens or anything? But does the mere presence of foreign people and foreign customs make them more amenable to Israeli people, Jewish customs, Jewish interests? Or does that not play in there?
So the Emiratis explicitly say so, yes. They will say to you in any serious intellectual discussion that you'll have that we are a open-minded, pluralistic people. Not only do we have 8.5 million foreign workers here in the Emirates, mostly from India, Pakistan, and Egypt, but we have businessmen from across the Muslim world, including many, many Iranian businessmen. There's a tremendous amount of Iranian money and Iranian business that flows through Dubai and Abu Dhabi, all the while that the UAE views Iran, the country, the Republic of Iran, as a fierce enemy and a dangerous enemy. And they host American air bases, and yes, they host many Iranian businessmen. And they will tell you that our openness to Jews from around the world and to Israelis is a function of that. They use two terms. Maybe I should have mentioned this earlier. You know, in fact, they almost never talk about Iran as Iran, and they almost never talk about the Palestinians as Palestinians. They have euphemisms. Their euphemisms are that we, the Emiratis, are mature, as opposed to other immature forces in the region. That refers to the Palestinians. And they'll say that we Emiratis are moderate, as opposed to other forces in the region which are radical. That refers to the Iranians. Or we are forward-looking, as opposed to being stuck in the hatreds of the past. That, of course, being another reference to the Iranians. They like to think of themselves as indeed global citizens that are open to the world. It's certainly true for those 1.5 Emiratis who are actually citizens of the country. We didn't have too much exposure to the 8.5 million foreign workers that are there, other than those who are trained to work in the tourist industry, who of course are, mild-mannered. Anybody who works in a hotel or drives a taxi or works in a museum is obviously got with the part. How do the Pakistanis and the Indians who are building the 1.5 million skyscrapers that are going up in Dubai, how do they feel? I don't know. By the way, they say that 35% of all building cranes in the world are in Dubai. And when you're there, you can easily believe that.
Well, that does make them different than your other so-called peace partners, the Jordanians and the Egyptians, who do not really even pretend to be cosmopolitan people. And we know how the Palestinians reacted to the accord, but there's another group of people that may be straddling this fence in another way. What about Israeli Arabs? What do you see from a population of Arabs who are citizens of the state of Israel, who have all the rights and privileges of the state of Israel, yet they're Arabs and mostly Muslims, some Christians, mostly Muslims? How do they see the Abraham Accords? And do you think there's any possibility of travel for them to the Gulf?
I haven't really discussed the matter with Israeli Arab colleagues and friends, so I don't want to make up something I don't know. I will tell you that many, many Israeli Arabs traveled to Dubai in December. There were thousands of them. Part of that 66,000 strong Israeli contingent that flew to Dubai, we saw many Arab families. One assumes this is the wealthier segment of the Israeli Arab community. They were buying everything. They were shopping in the malls. We saw them in all the tourist sites. There's a place called the Global Village in Dubai. It's sort of their version of Epcot Center, where every country in the region and many countries in the world have their own pavilions. They're gigantic pavilions, each designed to look like the country that they're representing, with real people from those countries manning each pavilion. So, I mean, we walked around, I spoke to Saudis and Iranians and Kuwaitis and Egyptians and Jordanians. The only place across a week in the Emirates where I felt uncomfortable was in the Palestine pavilion at the Global Village. The stairs were icy. The responses were monosyllable. The minute they saw a Jew or an Israeli, they had no interest in engaging or selling us anything. There will be, by this time next year, an Israeli pavilion at the Global Village. And there is going to be a very large Israeli pavilion at the UAE Expo. It was supposed to be Expo 220. It's been postponed to this fall, opening this fall, but there'll be a large Israeli pavilion. It's now under construction, opening there. It also includes a look at the lives of Israeli Arabs, which is a smart thing to do. And there are a number of major conferences planned, Israeli Gulf conferences planned for this fall in the Emirates and Bahrain for the opening of the Expo.
To the questioner who asked about health protocols and COVID-19, yes, I'm sure that all the health protocols are being followed, but I would also point out that Bahrain is number 2 to Israel in percentage of population inoculated. So I think there's something going on here that people are very attuned to their travel in a COVID-19 period. 2 questions, I'll put them together. Somebody asked us about Israel and Saudi Arabia, and Israel and Qatar, and whether, if you put them together, the American brokered agreement, it hasn't really been implemented yet, between Qatar and Saudi Arabia will make it easier for those countries to approach the Abraham Accords, or not.
Okay, those are very interesting questions, which gets us deep into strategic realities. I'll say, first of all, that I don't put much stock in the recently concluded reconciliation accord between the Saudis and the Qataris, between the Qataris and, in fact, all the other Gulf Arabs. The core issues of dispute are still there. That's the gigantic Iranian investment in Qatar, Qatar's support for the Iranians, Al Jazeera's support for the Iranians and its hostile approach to America, Israel, and the Gulf Arabs. Al Jazeera, of course, is based in Qatar. Qatar's support for Hamas, Qatar's relationship with the Turks. None of these issues have really been resolved, and it's, I guess, good that some veneer of renewed dialogue between the Saudis and the Qataris has been put in place, but I think it remains to be seen whether that really amounts to much, and whether that has an impact on the strategic calculations of actors like the Saudis. With regards to the Saudi Arabia specifically, two things are clear to me. One is that Bahrain and the Emirates and Morocco would never have moved forward to open peace with Israel without a Saudi green light. I could never have flown. 66,000 Israelis could never have flown into Dubai in December without flying over Saudi airspace. So it's clear that the Saudis are giving this their backing. I think we're maybe 2 years away from a significant Saudi step towards Israel, and there's a couple reasons for that. First of all, the Saudis want to be able to show, or the Saudi leadership wants to be able to show to its own people that there's a real peace benefit. That's why it's important that the Bahrain-Israel and the UAE-Israel treaties advance, that the economic relationship advance significantly, that real gains for the Arab side of the equation are able to be shown. Now, you know, there's only 1.5 million Emiratis and even fewer Bahrainis. Saudi Arabia has 25 million people, and it's a country that is made up of rival tribes with a still very powerful clerical elite, and the royal house with hundreds or thousands of princes who don't all share the same opinion, and a king, King Salman, who's perhaps, so they say, less enthusiastic about moving towards Israel than is his son, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince. And therefore, it will take some time before the Saudis go whole hog, to use an inappropriate metaphor for an Islamic country. Although I think we'll continue to see some moves towards Israel that are discernible and recognizable both to Israelis and other countries in the region.
So, excuse me. As you mentioned, Saudi Arabia has a large religious component to its thinking. A listener writes, fundamentalist imams in the United States are glad to recognize Jews as a religious community, but never recognize Jews as a people with ties to a land being the land of Israel. So they make a very great distinction between what they consider the religion of the Jews and the peoplehood of the Jews. How does that work with, first of all, the Emiratis clearly have accepted Israel as a country and Jews as the people of the country. Is that part of the Saudi problem, that Jews may be okay as Jews, but maybe Israel isn't okay as a manifestation of Jewish peoplehood?
I'm sure there are some Saudis or many Saudis who feel that way. Again, the beauty of the Abrahamic Accords is that by referencing a biblical patrimony, the Moroccans, Emiratis, and Bahrainis have essentially recognized an indigenous Jewish connection to the land of Israel and given credence and legitimacy to the state of Israel, the modern state of Israel, as a national homeland for the Jewish people. They haven't said it in such words, but the Abraham Accords were drafted, purposefully drafted. Read the preamble to the Abraham Accords, in which some very specific people in the Israeli government had a direct role in drafting. They purposely reference the Abrahamic narrative and the Abrahamic common heritage. If the Saudis come in on that basis, it will be a similar recognition. The very fact that Emirati and Bahraini leaders talk about great opportunities for the two peoples together, that they recognize Israel as a force for stability and prosperity in the Middle East, is the greatest recognition that we could ask for. After decades in which it was always argued, even in Washington, that Israel was the source of insecurity and instability in the Middle East, that cost America blood, what was it, blood, treasure, and...
Or blood, sweat, and tears, if you listen to rock music.
A phrase that President Obama used several times. And the Emiratis are saying not at all. It's others, radicals in the region, that are the cause of misery. Israel is a force for stability and for prosperity and for enlightenment, and that's why we're partnering with it. I would hope that the Saudis will eventually move forward on the basis of the same narrative, but that remains to be seen.
So Israel has made it clear that it will not object to the sale of F-35 airplanes to the UAE. Qualitative military edge, the rules about it say Israel should be able to defend itself against any likely combination of conventionally armed adversaries. Has Israel taken UAE out of the possibility of joining some coalition against Israel? Is this a real security sea change as well as political sea change?
So yes, it is. The Israeli-Emirati security partnership goes back quite a few years. It's not something that's been talked about.
This is important because I think a lot of our listeners don't know this. So.
The Israeli-Emirati security partnership is growing. It's mainly intelligence-based, both in terms of monitoring Iranian movements in the Gulf region and throughout the Middle East. It's also based on protecting the Emirates from the incursion of radical Shiite forces, radical Shiite groups, radical Shiite imams. And Israel expects that security partnership will grow. The F-35s are a specific issue in themselves because it's the most advanced fighter in the world. One needs to remember two things in this regard. Number one, Israel already flies 2 squadrons of the F-35. It's the first country in the world to make them operational and to actually fly combat missions of the F-35. Israel's version of the F-35, of course, is a Israeli souped up version of the F-35. And by the time the Emiratis get their first F-35 fighter jet, which will be approximately 10 years from now, I repeat that, the Emiratis are going to get their first F-35 approximately 10 years from now. The Israeli F-35 abilities and American F-35 abilities will go way beyond what the Emiratis will know or have. And therefore, there are many ways in which Israel's qualitative military edge can be maintained as long as there's good partnership with Washington going forward for maintaining that QME. And the Emiratis are secure in a Western Israel and Israeli security orbit. You know, there's always the danger in the Middle East of what we call blowback. God forbid the Iranians should invade and take over Emirati and American air bases. In the Emirates, there's a tremendous amount of advanced weaponry that would fall into Iranian hands, but none of the parties in this region intend to let that happen.
So normally we end the conversation on a question that requires a positive answer from the speaker. But I don't have one of those for you at the moment. So I'm going to end on a slightly different note. Several people have asked us the question, what about the Biden administration? So I'm going to phrase the question this way. A lot of people in this country are holding their breath to see what comes out of a Biden administration. Is Israel holding its breath, or do you have good feelings about it? A lot of these people are people that are well known in Israel. How does Israel see the incoming administration?
Every Israeli leader, from David Ben-Gurion to Benjamin Netanyahu, has seen it as his first and foremost priority to develop a close working relationship, and over the last decades, close strategic ties with whatever administration is elected in Washington. Now, there's no denying that with the Trump administration, Israel had the most special of relationships. I don't need to recount here the very many things that Trump did, the very many steps he took that Israel viewed as critical for diplomacy in the Middle East and Israel's security in the Middle East. And the first and foremost of them was withdrawing from the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, and reimposing significant and successive wave of heavy sanctions on the Iranians. Israel is concerned that a rush to a new deal with the Iranians could come at the expense of critical Israeli interests. Israel's view is, and it does have a dialogue with the Biden administration or the incoming leadership team of the Biden administration on these matters, that number one, it would be a mistake for Washington to fritter away the leverage it has built up over Iran through sanctions before reaching a deal or trying to reach a deal with the Iranians. Second of all, that any new deal must extend decades into the future. The notion that sanctions against Iran or military restrictions on Iran's nuclear program begin sunsetting 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now, that can't be part of a new deal with the Iranians. Nor can a new deal with the Iranians ignore Iran's ballistic missile program. You only develop ballistic missiles to carry nuclear weapons. And of course, a new deal with the Iranians has to take into account the terrible and aggressive hostile actions and maneuvers of the Republic of Iran against America's regional partners, such as the Saudis and the Emiratis, against American interests in Iraq, against Israeli and Western interests in Syria, and so on. So it's a tall order. The Iranians seem to think that they are going to get a quick and easy peasy deal with President Biden. I hope they're wrong. I hope that the Biden administration, Israelis hope that the Biden administration will play a tough game, which is necessary in order to get anything serious from the Iranians. Certainly, we don't view the accord as it was negotiated as something that would benefit America or Israel if it's simply put back on the table and everybody swears renewed loyalty to it. So yes, we do have concerns going forward, but there are good indications that the Biden administration is interested in developing a dialogue on this, both with Gulf Arabs and with Israel, and to taking into account the considerations of these parties who actually are the parties on the front line with Iran here in the Middle East. So with that.
So I'm going to take that as a positive answer. And on that note, I'm going to thank you so much for a really enlightening program. I haven't been to Bahrain. I don't think most of the people who were on this call have been there. So I feel like we got a good sense of what they're thinking, what Israel is thinking, and why it's so important. And for that, David Weinberg, we thank you, and we hope you'll join us again.
Thank you, Shoshana, and good evening from Jerusalem.